JJ Short Stories brings you Disastrous Summer by JJ Flores. On the last day of school at Brownsville, Daniel's friends surrounded him in the hallway. If you don't believe the number of friends he has, let's list them all. Ben, Maria, Sean, and Holly. "What's up, everyone?" asked Daniel. "Hey," said Sean. "Guess what? I'm going to New York this summer." Just then their teacher, Mr. Buster Longjohns, opened the classroom door. Daniel and his friends rushed in. Behind them rushed in the other four classmates, Ian, Boris, Horace and Leo. Mr. Buster closed the door and then smiled warmly at his class. With tears in his eyes, he walked up to his desk, and to the class's astonishment he pulled out a handkerchief and went into a ramble. "It has been so awesome to teach you excellent, smart kids this year. I really hate that I won't be able to teach another third grade class like you guys again." Daniel and Leo quickly got off their chairs. Leo patted Mr. Buster on the back and said, Now, it's okay." Nathaniel asked Mr. Buster, "How long have you been teaching third grade?" Mr. Buster looked down at them and said, "I've been teaching ever since I have arrived here. So, basically, I've been teaching third grade for about 2 years now." Looking awkward, Daniel and Leo went back to their seats. "Sorry, I didn't mean to get so emotional there, but you students are probably the best class I've had yet." "So Mr. Buster, what are you doing this summer?" asked Maria. Mr. Buster responded by telling them that he and his wife are going to go to Paris this summer. Then the class started shrieking and hollering about the Eiffel Tower. Mr. Buster excitedly waved his hand at the shouting class. Yes, he shouted over the excitedly amplified voices. "My wife is very keen on getting a picture of that Eiffel Tower too." "Hey," said Nathaniel, "my sister Annie reads about the Eiffel Tower." "Well then, your sister must be an intelligent young lady." After 5 minutes of the class talking excitedly about what they were doing for the summer, Mr. Buster said in a raised voice because the kids were getting louder in their chit-chat, "Well, I was thinking we could do a little project," he shouted. "What is it, sir?" shouted Boris. Mr. Buster went on to tell them they should write some great memories of the school semesters that they can remember. As usual, Ben was the first to shout out something. Usually during the school year, Ben usually comes up with the answer faster than anyone in the class. "Remember the time Maria fell off the jungle gym at recess?" Maria turned red and sank in her chair. Before Holly could speak in Maria's defense to tell Ben that memory was not funny, half the class was already writing excitedly. "Oh hey," says Holly, thinking of a retaliation for Ben. "Do you remember the time in the cafeteria, when Ben ate too much food from a dare from a second grader and vomited before he could reach the toilet?" Daniel and Leo both opened their mouths furiously to speak in Ben's defense, but before they could the class was excitedly writing it down and Ben looked as though he wanted to curse using censors. So for the next 5 minutes, the class gleefully took it in turns to come up with embarrassing memories of each other throughout the school year. It turns out that everyone in the classroom has a very embarrassing memory of themselves. When they were finished, Mr. Buster took their papers. Scanning their papers, he began to laugh at what was written on each paper. "What are we going to do now?" asked Horace. A few minutes later, they were all standing in alphabetical order in line behind the classroom door. Finally, Mr. Buster told them even though 5th grade isn't here, the party for 3rd and 4th grade was still going to happen as planned. Mr. Buster made Ian hold open the door, then all 8 of them filed out into the hallway. Ian took his place in line after closing the door. Meanwhile, in the 2nd grade classroom, Nathaniel was excitedly showing the class a drawing he made last night. After everyone swooned over his drawing, Mrs. Roberts, the teacher, said, "Everyone can have free time for 10 minutes until lunch." Samuel and his 2 friends, James and Fred, seized all of the crayons and started drawing on pieces of paper. Nathaniel, on the other hand, and her 2 best friends had gotten a hold of all the Play-Doh and began making pretend pizza and other suppers out of it. One of Annie's best friends, Mary Ann, had come up with the idea of inventing foods that didn't exist out of the Play-Doh. Meanwhile, all 9 of the 3rd graders and Mr. Buster arrived at the 4th grade classroom and knocked on the door. A smiling man, by the name of Mr. John, opened the door. Everyone filed into the classroom. "Why hello there," said Mr. John, Would any of you like a snack? He asked, pointing to a table that was piled high with pastries. Daniel looked around at all of the 5 fourth graders, 3 of whom were girls. The girls' names were Hope, Laura, and Michaela. As for the boys, their names were Avery and Nathan. All of them were eating some sort of pastry. Yes please, shouted all of the 3rd graders together. Daniel stared at all of the pastries as he got closer and closer to the table. He decided to get a blueberry muffin. Actually, he realized he got the last of the blueberry muffins. The only 2 seats left were next to Michaela or Hope, and Daniel decided to sit next to Michaela. Boris, who got a jam donut, sat next to Hope. Poor Leo, Sean, Horace, Holly, Ian, Maria, and Ben had to sit on the floor. As everyone ate, rather quietly, Daniel thought. Mr. John clapped his hands together and said, "As it is the last day of school, why don't you tell us what you're going to be doing this summer, Michaela?" Michaela cleared her throat. "Well, I am going to the beach this summer, and I might be going to Switzerland." Everyone clapped. Next up was Avery, who said, "I might be going to try and climb Mount Everest with my family over the summer." Then went Laura, who said, "I have no idea of what my summer holds for me." Hope then said, "I am going to go to Paris this summer." Lastly Nathan said, "I am going fishing this summer." "Excellent," said Mr. John, clapping. "Right," says Mr. Buster. "Daniel, why don't you tell us what you are doing this summer?" "Well, me and my family are going to the beach this summer to surf. Then we are going to celebrate my birthday in July." Next up was Holly, who like Laura, didn't know what she was going to be doing this summer. Finally, when every 3rd grader said what they were going to be doing this summer, it was lunchtime. As everyone, 3rd graders and 4th graders, lined up for lunch in the cafeteria, Annie and Samuel Nathaniel, Daniel's brother and sister, walked by them on their way to their table. When Daniel finally got his lunch, a hot dog, a hamburger, a cupcake, and a drink, he and his friends walked over to their usual table. Daniel, who saw Annie and Samuel sitting next to the 2nd graders, waved at them to come and join him. Daniel heard Samuel ask his teacher if he and Annie could sit with him. A second later, Annie and Samuel slid into the last 2 seats at the table. All 7 of them started eating and talking. "Well, I am going to the public pool," says Ben. "On the 4th of July, they're doing the fireworks over there." "Hey," says Samuel Nathaniel, "we're going to the beach to surf this summer." "Well, I hope I become a good surfer. Because last time, well, you know." Daniel had a feeling he knew why Samuel wasn't telling everyone what happened. Last time, Samuel had entered the waves with the surfboard a few inches from his face. Even Daniel knew you shouldn't do that. At the time Daniel had been shouting at Samuel to hold the surfboard away from his face. Either Samuel was ignoring Daniel on purpose or he couldn't hear Daniel over the roaring of the waves. Samuel knocked out. Yeah, that didn't look too pretty. No one needs to see him get smacked in the face by a surfboard. Although Maria pried for details, Samuel changed the topic quickly. Soon lunch was over, and Samuel and Annie disappeared around the corner to join the other 2nd graders in line. Samuel waved at Daniel and shouted, "See you at recess, Daniel." Seeing Daniel's shocked face, Holly says, "Well, it is the last day of school, and everyone in kindergarten through 5th grade will be there. We all get to go outside at the same time today. Well, 4th grade because 5th grade is not here today." When they were back in class, Mr. Buster said they could play games for half an hour until they could go outside for recess. Boris, Horace, Leo, and Ian seized all the crayons. Daniel and the rest of his friends had gotten a hold of all the Legos. As Daniel was building a sword to destroy all of his friends' weapons, Daniel heard Boris say, "Hey Horace, look at my drawing." Horace looked at the drawing Boris had made for a long time. Horace asked, "Is that a feathery git?" "No," said Boris in mock outrage. "I tried to draw you falling off Mount Everest." Daniel's sword, aiming for Ben's weird weapon, had been shattered by Maria's sword. He ha ha ha, Ben laughed. "That's why I called this weapon Powerful Shakes," says Ben. Though he stopped laughing once Daniel was able to destroy it. All of them were having so much fun that they had no idea how many Legos were scattered everywhere, which happened to be miniature Legos by the way. "All right, please, Everyone clean up, said Mr. Buster half an hour later. Daniel and his friends climbed laboriously to their feet. As Mr. Buster walked past them, to help clean up the crayons that were scattered all over the desk at the back of the classroom, he stopped and stared at all the Legos interspersed everywhere. My, will everyone please come and help these 5 clean up all these Legos all over the floor, asked Mr. Buster. 2 minutes later everyone ran outside into the small playground at the back of the school. Leo and Boris headed towards the jungle gym. Most of the second graders, including Annie Nathaniel, rode tricycles. Michaela, Hope, and Laura were playing hopscotch. All of the first grade and kindergarteners played on the swings. Avery and Nathan were wandering around the playground looking bored. Daniel and his 4 friends found Samuel near the jungle gym. Where's Annie Nathaniel? Asked Holly. Over there, riding a tricycle, said Samuel. Anyways, what does everyone think of a good game of tag? Asked Daniel Nathaniel. Great idea, but I'm not it, says Sean. They all agreed Maria would be it. As Maria started counting down from 10, everyone ran away not wanting to be tagged. 9, 8, 7, Maria counted. As Maria got closer to 1, everyone ran faster. Most unfortunately for Ben, he had barely gone down the slide when Maria hurtled down a slide to his right and tagged him. They played 6 great rounds of tag, but they stopped when Daniel accidentally ran through the middle of Hope, Laura, and Michaela's hopscotch game and got scratched due to falling hard on the concrete. Michaela helped Daniel up. After recess, everyone started packing the last of their items that remained in their lockers. When they were all done, Mr. Buster hugged each of his 3rd graders, but as he hugged Daniel, Daniel said, "You will have my brother and sister when you teach 3rd graders next year." Mr. Buster nodded and said, "If they're anything like you, I can't wait." Have a good summer, Mr. Buster, said Daniel. Finally, when the clock struck 3, school was finally over. The kids who were going onto the buses streamed through the front door down to the bus loop. Students who were parent pickup made their way to the principal's office to wait for their parents. Surprisingly, there was a short list of kids who were parent pickup. Avery from 4th grade, Daniel from 3rd grade, and a boy who everyone called Fernando from 2nd grade, and of course Annie and Samuel. Melanie Nathaniel, the mother of Annie, Samuel, and Daniel Nathaniel, always picked them up from parent pickup at school. Unsurprisingly, all 3 Nathaniels didn't know what it was like to ride the bus home. Everyone who was parent pickup sat in the office for 5 minutes before Avery's mom arrived to pick him up. Have a good summer, Principal Flyer said to Avery. Have a great summer, said Avery and his mom in unison. Then the 2 of them swept out of the office and left. Next was Fernando's mom to pick him up. Now it was only Samuel, Annie, and Daniel Nathaniel left. As 5 minutes slowly went by, Melanie Nathaniel finally arrived to take the kids home. You 3 have a good summer, Principal Flyer said to them. Have a great summer, said all the Nathaniels simultaneously as Melanie Nathaniel led the kids out of the office and to the car. When they got into the car, Melanie started playing music. First up was Side to Side. So how was the last day of school? She asked her kids. Annie, Samuel, and Daniel each took turns to tell her how their day was at school. 10 minutes later they arrived at their home. Before Melanie opens the door she says, "In an hour we are going out to eat as an end-of-school celebration." Annie was the first one to take a shower, then Samuel, and lastly Daniel. They spent the rest of their hour playing tag upstairs until Annie accidentally knocked over a vase that their deceased father, Fallon, had bought for decoration when he was alive. When Melanie saw that the vase had been shattered, she went pale but said it was okay, and cleaned up all the shattered glass on the floor. Soon they were in the car on the way to Outback Steakhouse. 5 minutes later they were sitting at a booth in the restaurant. Their waiter, Ram, had already ordered their drinks. Samuel and Daniel had gotten iced tea, while Annie and Mom had gotten strawberry lemonade. Melanie Nathaniel tapped her phone while staring down at the menu. Daniel and Samuel had been gulping down their iced tea as if they hadn't drunken anything in days. You know, if you keep drinking like that, by the time our food comes you won't have anything left to drink, Annie says with a heavy sigh. Don't care, Daniel and Samuel chorused together. I am thinking of getting steak and fries, Daniel said. Samuel immediately agreed. Daniel didn't mind if the steak and fries came with ketchup. Daniel wasn't a big fan of ketchup, but it was something he could eat without complaint. Melanie Nathaniel decided to get a salad, while Annie decided to get fried chicken with some bloomin' fried onions as an appetizer. When their waiter, Ram, came, he asked if they were ready to order food. For these two, Mom said as she pointed to Samuel and Daniel, they will have steak and fries. T-bone steak or T-bone, interrupted Samuel. And a rare steak please, says Daniel Nathaniel. When Melanie had ordered hers and Annie's meals, the waiter left. Daniel seized a dinner roll off one of the plates Ram had left when he brought over the drinks. Daniel, if you keep eating by the time the food comes, you will be full, Annie says. Don't care, says Daniel, this could be my appetizer. Please don't snap at your sister, Melanie says, snapping out of a daze. Hey Daniel, says Samuel, let's play I Spy. Unfortunately, when Samuel went first, he says, I spy with my little eyes a someone with a wart on their nose, referring to the man behind them. The man glared at Samuel, very offended. Samuel, you can't say that about people, Mom whispered. Melanie Nathaniel looked apologetically at the man and said, sorry about my son. The man grunted and said something about Samuel that sounded like idiot boy underneath his breath as he turned away. Watch what you say about my brother, says Daniel. The man acted as though he hadn't heard Daniel, even though he had shouted pretty loudly. Melanie Nathaniel leaned across the table, and then gave Daniel her phone. Will this calm you down? She asked Daniel and Samuel. You can't go around saying things like that to people. Slightly guilty, both the boys nodded a yes, then went on Mom's phone to see what they could find on YouTube. Mom stared blankly up at the ceiling, thinking about how one of her workers had been fired unfairly just because he had arrived 20 minutes late every day this past week. She felt even more guilty because the boss always left her in charge, so she felt like she could have prevented this. 10 minutes later, their food arrived. Daniel and Samuel reluctantly turned off their YouTube video and gave the phone back to their mom. For the first 4 minutes of the meal, no one spoke much. Then unexpectedly Mom told the kids about her situation at work. He got fired, just for being late, Mom added. And I'm worried that it might happen to me if I am late. Your boss sounds really unfair, Annie said, patting Mom on the shoulder. Both Daniel and Samuel were looking awkward. Daniel quickly wondered if that was something he would have to face when he gets older. Hey, says Samuel, trying to cheer Mom up a bit, what should we do for the summer? It seemed to have gotten Mom out of her head for a bit and she looked a little brighter. Well, I am going to have to leave you at a friend's house because I have to come into work for a few weeks. Daniel gasped, not one of your friends' houses. No, Mom said, taking a bite of her salad. Probably at Hope or Laura's house. I hear they're good friends of yours at school. Daniel and Samuel's forks fell onto their plates with a clatter. But, we don't even know them that well, Daniel stuttered. Even Annie had dropped some of her food in shock. Well, Mom said, that's even more of a reason to go. Who wants to go to Hope's house? Samuel, Annie, and Daniel looked at each other with disbelief. Was Mom actually going through with her plan? Mom, being an interactive parent at school, was very keen to talk to every mom at school, but when it came to a dad or grandpa, she flat out refused to interact with them. Maybe it was because it brought back painful memories of Fallon. So, basically, she didn't know half of Daniel's friends' parents. Sean had a dad, Ben had a dad, and they both didn't have a mom. So, of course, Mom would know both Hope's and Laura's moms before Samuel, Annie, and Daniel got to know Hope and Laura themselves. Hope's, says Annie. No, Laura's, says Samuel. Don't care which, says Daniel distractedly. Ah, says Samuel, come on, you're the tiebreaker. Fine then, says Daniel, your mama's house. Everyone at the table snorted into their drinks. Even Daniel managed a small laugh. Very funny, says Mom. Honestly, says Daniel, I don't care which. Everyone, including Mom, kept pestering him so much that he finally blurted out Hope. When the Nathaniels left, it was beginning to dawn on Samuel, Daniel, and Annie what being at her house for half the day would mean. For one thing, they would be under a roof with someone they don't know all that well. Not to mention it would be their first time being 18 hours away from Mom. Not that her house was far, it was 5 minutes from their house. When they got home, the kids got changed into their pajamas, and Mom tucked them into bed. After kissing her sons and daughter on the forehead, she bade them a good night and left the room. Oh well, Daniel thought as he was drifting into sleep, at least tomorrow is Saturday, May 27th. They would get to spend 2 whole days with Mom before they were sent to the home of hope. The next morning, someone decided to jerk the blanket away from Daniel's sleeping profile and they yelled for Daniel to wake up so loudly that Daniel actually attacked the sleep intruder and shouted, "Who are you, lunatic?" A very surprised Samuel looked up at Daniel, who had him in a chokehold. When Daniel realized he was choking Samuel, he let go immediately. "Sorry," says Daniel as he tries to console his brother, "but maybe you shouldn't wake me up like that." Annie started laughing from the doorway as she witnessed the whole scene unfold, all while she was brushing her teeth. Finally, when all 3 Nathaniels went downstairs, Mom had a bowl of cereal waiting for each of them on the table. When Daniel looked at the clock on the back of the wall, it read, 9 a.m. Mom, who is halfway done with her breakfast, sighed, as the kids started helping themselves to their cornflakes. "What should we do today?" says Samuel. "Go to the beach, of course," says Annie. "Oh yeah," says Daniel, "we can go surfing." Mom looked at the kids and said, "That sounds like a great..." She was cut off as her phone began to ring. "Who is this?" Mom said, speaking into the phone. Whoever was on the other side seemed to be talking in a hurry. Mom said things like, "Yes, I understand, have a great time." That made Daniel wonder what was going on. When Mom hung up the phone, she turned to the kids and told them some exciting news. At least it was to Daniel. Apparently Hope is going on a trip to Paris starting this weekend, and she won't come back until July 14th. Just then Daniel cut in, "That's my birthday. And you guys will have to stay at Laura's house," continued Mom. Daniel and Annie nearly dropped their orange juice and Samuel choked on his cereal. They would still have to be under the same roof with someone they didn't know that well. "Hey," said Samuel, trying to cheer up Annie and Daniel, "what about going to the beach?" We should pack a picnic," Annie said. "I can't wait to go surfing today," Daniel said as he finished his cornflakes. "I am going to bring a book," says Annie. Annie had never been a great surfer, and she didn't seem to have the ambition to become one either. "You're reading, even though it's summertime?" asked Daniel, astonished. "You know what, I think we should all bring a book to the beach," says Mom. Both Daniel and Samuel traded glances of astonishment, then Samuel said, "Ha ha hee hee, very freaking funny." "No, I am serious," Mom said to Samuel. "What should we have for our picnic?" asked Daniel, trying to take Samuel's mind off of the prospect of having to read a book at the beach. "Sandwiches, a bag of chips, and soda, of course," said Samuel with a hint of glee as the change in subject occurred. "We should have water since we're going to be in the sun anyways," Annie proclaimed. "Soda," Samuel protested. "Annie is right. We should have water. We can't just be dehydrated and drink sodas all day," Mom says to Samuel. Soon Samuel was protesting with both Annie and Mom. Daniel, however, stayed out of it. Daniel didn't mind if they had water or soda at the beach. "So," said Daniel, trying to remind everyone he was still there, "for chips, I think I will have cheddar ruffles." In time the agreement finally ended with Annie shouting, "Water." "Oh yeah," says Samuel, "probably Cool Ranch Doritos for me." Finally, when breakfast was over, Samuel, Annie, and Nathaniel rushed upstairs to take their showers. Daniel and Annie played with their marble run while Samuel was in the shower, then Daniel, and, finally, Annie. By 10:30 everything was packed, the picnic and drinks in the cooler, the beach umbrella, and the surfing boards that Daniel and Samuel were holding in their hands. "Oh, buckets to build sand castles at the beach," said Annie at the last possible moment. Thankfully, they were taking water and not sodas. After Mom loaded everything into the trunk, Mom opened the car door of their brand new red, 2023 Toyota Highlander. Annie, Daniel, and Samuel jumped inside, the kids fastened their seatbelts, and then they were off to the beach. Mom put on the radio of some podcast, whilst the kids talked gleefully about what they were going to do at the beach, as a cop drove past them. "I can't wait to out surf a wave," said Daniel. "Same here," said Samuel. I can't wait to build sand castles, though you can't spend all your time in the ocean while we're at the beach. Annie chimed in as she picked up a book and started reading the pages as if it was a cartoon on the screen of a phone. The podcast was going on and on about some missing kid, who had somehow sneaked onto an airplane at the airport on a flight making its way to Brazil yesterday. I can't wait to dig into those ruffles, Daniel said. Try not to get sand on the food, says Samuel. When they finally arrived at the beach, luck was on their side when they easily found a parking spot. The beach was jam-packed. Mom was carrying the duffel bag across her shoulder containing the beach umbrella and the buckets, while dragging the cooler with the picnic and drinks. Annie was holding 2 books while Daniel and Samuel were holding their surfboards, and reluctantly, a book each. As they were making their way down onto the sand, Daniel and Samuel waved their surfboards excitedly. Daniel accidentally bumped into a girl as she and a woman were walking by. Sorry, said Daniel, backing away. It's okay, said the girl. Come on Laura, let's get in the car already, said the woman, who must be her mom. Suddenly, Daniel knew who she was. Laura from school. Mom looked back to see what was holding Daniel up, and, of course, she recognized Laura's mom. Laura's mom must have recognized Melanie, because she said, Hi there, Mrs. Nathaniel. It's a pleasure to see you, she said as she shook her hand. Laura, Annie, Samuel, and Daniel looked away. Both moms seemed to have forgotten that their kids were standing behind them. 5 minutes later, though it seemed like an hour had passed for Daniel, both moms had come to realize that their kids just stood there silent. Mom, can we stay here for a little longer? Laura asked. Daniel turned as red as their brand new Highlander. He only bumped into Laura accidentally. He didn't think that this meant that Laura and her mom would be spending time with them at the beach. It was already strange enough that they would have to spend time with Laura for half a month. Of course, said Laura's mom. Samuel whispered in Daniel's ear, this is not how things were supposed to go. Daniel jerked his head up, I know. They made their way down to the beach together and found a spot on the beach. Both moms created a lot of shade by putting up both their beach umbrellas together. Laura and Daniel got to work by putting all the towels down so everyone could sit down. After a few moments of their moms talking non-stop, Laura decided to break the tension and spoke to Daniel, Samuel, and Annie. It's weird that we ran into each other at the beach. Did you know last night my mom told me that you 3 will be staying at our house for half a month? All 3 of them seemed to ignore her. Daniel was feeling a tad bit shy and furious. He barely knew Laura and now both of their moms were talking like they didn't exist. Annie was deeply immersed in her book as she pretended not to notice that Laura had spoken. Samuel was mindlessly gazing into the water. Hello, Laura said a little louder than she had meant to, as she waved her hands back and forth in front of Daniel's face to get his attention. Daniel continued to stare at Annie, who Laura decided to try next. However, Annie continued to lose herself in the book, oblivious to those around her. Finally, she attempted to get Samuel's attention, but he just continued to look at the water with a longing expression on his face. Laura sighed and sat down on the towel next to her mom. Just then, Laura's mom turned away from Melanie Nathaniel, and told Laura, you know, you should talk to those 3. Laura looked at her mom when she said, what excuse now? Did Nate or Ethan tell you not to talk to anyone today? Or did Pennywise offer you a hefty prize money not to talk to them? I tried, they just don't want to talk to me. Laura sighed. Melanie turned to her kids and sternly said, Daniel, why don't you try talking to? Before she could finish her sentence, Laura's mom interrupted her, don't worry Mrs. Nathaniel. Yesterday she refused to give her phone to Nate because he doesn't have a phone. So being amiable is not her strong suit. That's because he asks for my phone every 2 hours and last time I checked, it's my phone. I was under the impression I do not have to share my phone if I chose not to. Laura fired back. Daniel looked around quick enough to glimpse Laura's mom slap her on the wrist. The last time I checked, you do not talk to me that way. Snapped Laura's mom. Shocking as it may be, Laura didn't even flinch at what just occurred. Daniel felt bad for Laura and clearly, both Annie and Samuel witnessed it too. Melanie suggested that they should begin building sand castles. Daniel knew that his mom was just as shocked as they had been at what just happened. Finally, Daniel decided to talk to Laura to ease the tension. "What iPhone do you have?" Daniel asked Laura. "An iPhone 11, Laura said glumly. "Did you know that the Google Pixel camera on the iPhone 15? But Daniel got cut off as Annie asked a weird question. "What is your mom's name?" "Her name is Ava," Laura replied. Ava turned around and glared at Laura. "You call me mom," she said nastily. "But I was just..." "No excuses," Ava snapped, turning away. "That's mommy dearest for you," Laura hissed underneath her breath. After 10 minutes of them building sand castles, the Nathaniels considered Laura their new friend. "Can we go surfing now?" Samuel asked his mom. Mom agreed. "Can I watch you guys surf?" Laura asked. "Of course you can," said Samuel. Annie brought her book along with her and, sadly, Ava was trotting not far behind them. "Don't you want to surf?" Laura asked Annie. "Nah, I am a fan of books and plus I want to be smart and prepared for 3rd grade," said Annie. "Samuel, wait," shouted Daniel as Samuel rushed into the waves. Daniel chased after him, but then that's when everything took a turn for the worst. Laura was clapping as Samuel and Daniel went charging into the water. Suddenly, Samuel began screaming. "Samuel, get back here right now," shouted Daniel. Daniel couldn't tell if Samuel's scream was from joy or fear. Just then a wave blocked Daniel's view of what happened next. There was one last scream, then a smashing sound and a heavy splash. When the wave cleared away, Daniel saw Samuel struggling to stay above the water, but it was confusing because it also looked like Samuel was trying to stay conscious. As Daniel got a little closer, he noticed blood running down Samuel's nose. That's when Daniel saw it, swimming effortlessly, cutting through the water with its dorsal fin, was a shark. Daniel rushed toward Samuel as quickly as he could and scooped him up and grabbed the surfboard. Struggling to get out of the water and dragging Samuel along was not easy. But at last, when Daniel had gotten out of the water, he yelled, "Shark!" at the top of his lungs. Strangely enough, a crowd had gathered around, and little did he know, some idiot was recording the entire event unfold and was planning to post it on YouTube. Out of nowhere, a person from the crowd shouted, "Hey, I know he is a freak surfer." Daniel saw red. "Hey moron. Watch what you say about my brother." Just then, Mom, Annie, Laura, and Ava managed to push their way through the crowd. When Mom got to Samuel, she scooped him up in a tight embrace, wiping away the blood from his face, leaving Daniel clutching his brother's surfboard for dear life. As if holding onto the surfboard would keep Samuel alive. "Are you okay?" asked Annie. "Wow," Ava chimed in. "You're more of a hero than Laura could ever be." Daniel sighed and shouted to the crowd slowly forming around him, "Hey. I am trying to warn you that there is a shark out in the ocean." Suddenly the crowd finally began to heed Daniel's warning and seemed to have dispersed from the scene. However, it seemed like the shark was turning toward the deep end and began swimming away from the shallow end. Mom trailed behind them as they trotted back to their spot on the beach. She was cradling Samuel and telling him he would be okay. Under the beach umbrellas, Daniel and Annie were crowded around Mom and Samuel. Laura and Ava loomed awkwardly around them. Slowly Samuel opened his eyes, gently releasing himself from his mother's arms. "What happened?" asked Samuel confusedly. Once Daniel had explained what happened, Samuel had begun to remember what occurred. "Well," Samuel said, "I saw the shark coming and I was too close to my surfboard at the time. Then, when I tried to turn around and warn you, the waves smashed into my surfboard and, unexpectedly, it took me by surprise and knocked me out." After everyone was done fretting over Samuel, even Ava, they started building sand castles while both moms laid out the picnic. Just as Daniel opened his mouth to talk to Samuel, Annie, and Laura, some gal from the crowd came running up to their spot on the beach. A camera was in her hand and Daniel had a horrible feeling of what she was going to do with it. "Hi, name's Emily. Can I take a picture of the freak surfer?" she said. Daniel immediately sprang forward and knocked the camera out of her hands. "If you call my brother a freak surfer one more time," Daniel snapped. Annie lays her hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Come on Daniel, let's ignore what she says." "It was cool the way you defended your brother," said Laura. Mom waved them over to the towels, in a way that told them it was time to eat. Since Laura and Ava had been leaving by the time the Nathaniels arrived, Mom thought it was a good idea to share part of her sandwich with Ava. Daniel and Annie decided to share their sandwich with Laura. Daniel even shared some of his ruffles with Laura too. After the picnic was over, Daniel asked Ava, "How did you know we would be staying at your house for half a month?" Oh, Ava says, "Your mom sent me a message and discussed her situation with me. I thought that would be pretty obvious." They kept the conversation going for a little bit as Melanie began packing up, starting with putting the leftovers of the picnic into the cooler. When they were all packed and ready to go, Laura waved at the Nathaniels as they made their way to their Highlander, which the Nathaniels shared a wave of their own back to her. Once Daniel, Samuel, and Annie had their seatbelts fastened, Mom started driving home. Annie started reading her book again, while Daniel kept Samuel from dozing off. It was not good for him to be dozing off after what had happened to him at the beach today. "Hey Mom," Daniel said shyly, "why does Ava mistreat Laura?" "I don't know. Usually at parent meetings she isn't that way." When Mom pulled up to the driveway, Daniel had to shake Samuel roughly to keep him from dozing off. Mom told each of the kids to head inside the house and take a shower while she unpacked everything from the car. First Samuel showered, then Daniel, and, finally, Annie. The next morning when everyone woke up, the Nathaniels brushed their teeth as usual and headed downstairs for breakfast. However, Mom told them breakfast wasn't ready yet. The Nathaniels slouched into the living room, very aware that they were hungry. Annie tried to ease the silence which seemed to suffocate them. "Hey Daniel, what do you want for your birthday this year?" "I don't know," a sleepy Daniel lied, "probably a piece of breakfast." Oddly enough, Daniel was lying through his teeth. He did know what he wanted for his birthday and it wasn't breakfast. 30 minutes later, Mom shouted, "Breakfast is ready." A gleeful Samuel, Daniel, and Annie all rushed to the kitchen table. Somehow the Nathaniels seemed to hold back and not devour the breakfast because they had to say grace, otherwise they would have gotten a stern look from Mom. For breakfast, Annie was the one to say grace, Daniel for lunch, and Samuel for dinner. So, Mom said to Daniel, "I know your birthday isn't for another couple of weeks, but I still want to know what you want." Immediately a phone popped into Daniel's head, but he was reluctant to mention it to Mom because she presumed they were too young to have a phone and would be irresponsible with it. However, last year, hadn't Daniel sneaked his mom's phone outside, while she was asleep to see if he could record himself catching Santa, which obviously worked. He returned it in mint condition, not a scratch or crack anywhere. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, and he was ready for her stare, ready to present all the facts as to why he was prepared to have a phone. "A phone," Daniel whispered. Mom's facial expression looked as though Daniel's response surprised her. Daniel quickly began to explain why before she could say anything. When Mom said "we will see," Daniel thought he saw, out of the corner of his eye, a look of jealousy in Samuel's eyes, but he shook his head rapidly and dismissed the thought as if he was hallucinating. "There is no way Samuel could be jealous, right?" "Anyway," said Samuel, "maybe we should go bowling today." "Great idea," Mom said. Daniel and Annie clapped their hands gleefully. When everyone showered after breakfast, they played hide and seek for an hour outside. Then Mom told them to get ready. Once everyone was in the Highlander with their seat belts fastened, Mom took off down the road. "So," Mom said to the kids, "after bowling I was thinking we should go out to eat for lunch." All of the kids clapped in unison. When they arrived at the bowling center, Samuel was telling Daniel over and over that he was trying to get a strike today. Daniel knew that in order to get a strike, Samuel had to knock down all 10 pins with the bowling ball. Samuel had not gotten a strike the last time they went bowling. The closest he had gotten to a strike was a spare. Annie never got one either, although Daniel has gotten a strike plenty of times. Once the Nathaniels had the bowling shoes required for bowling and assigned to a specific lane, they decided to start with the youngest going first and the oldest going last. Even Mom was planning to play, which meant Samuel would go first, then Annie, then Daniel, and lastly, Mom. Samuel grabbed a green bowling ball and eagerly walked to the bowling lane. As he was strategically game planning the best roll to ensure a strike, Daniel said from behind him, "The trick is to roll the ball down the middle, that way it knocks down all 10 pins." Samuel tried not to notice how much his hands were shaking as he let the bowling ball roll down the lane. For a minute, Samuel had thought things had gone awfully wrong, but just then, the bowling ball rolled right in the middle of the pins. Samuel jumped in the air. For a glorious moment, he imagined a strike. However, Annie grabbed his hand and pointed at the scoreboard. The number 8 was written in big bold numbers across the screen, crushing Samuel's spirit. This time, Samuel grabbed a lemon-colored bowling ball and rolled it glumly down the lane because he realized there were only 2 pins left and he had no shot knocking down both pins, and he felt pretty dumb at his current situation. A few seconds later, when Samuel looked at the scoreboard, he saw the number 1 on the screen. Feeling disappointed, he went to have a seat next to Mom. Annie grabbed a banana-colored bowling ball and confidently rolled the bowling ball down the middle of the lane, as Daniel tried to console a sulking Samuel. A moment later, the bowling ball went straight in the middle of all 10 pins, knocking them all down for the count. When Annie squealed gleefully, everyone turned to the scoreboard, even Samuel. Everyone clapped as they realized Annie had gotten the first strike of the day. Samuel tried not to sulk too much as Daniel also got a strike. Even Mom pulled through with a strike. As Daniel passed Samuel, who was glumly picking up a bowling ball, he could have sworn he saw that same look of jealousy in Samuel's eyes. This time, Samuel had gotten a spare. A confident Daniel told Samuel, "That's the closest you'll get to a strike today." Samuel shot him a withered glare. Samuel's mood worsened as Daniel got strike after strike, effortlessly, as if this was an everyday occurrence. Sometimes, Annie and Mom managed to get more strikes as well, but it was Daniel's smugness that infuriated Samuel. It finally felt like a weight had been lifted from Samuel's shoulders when Mom said it was time to go. When they were in the car, Daniel suggested that they should go to a pizza place to eat lunch. About 20 minutes later, the Nathaniels were sitting in a booth, ordering their pizza, but that's when Daniel noticed, on the other side of the restaurant, was Ben, deep in conversation with his dad. Daniel didn't know if he should run towards Ben and hug him, so Daniel was conflicted. Ben didn't seem to notice them. "What are you staring at?" Annie asked. Oh, I am going to order cheese sticks," Daniel mumbled, avoiding the question. Samuel and Mom were getting iced tea, Daniel strawberry lemonade, and Annie was getting what Daniel was getting. 10 minutes later, the Nathaniels were helping themselves to cheese sticks and pepperoni pizza. Mom even managed to order some brownies for dessert. Daniel saw that Ben seemed to be done with his conversation with his father. "Hey Ben," Daniel shouted. Ben turned to see who had shouted and noticed Daniel. "Oh, hey, Daniel," he shouted. "What have you done for the summer so far?" Ben shouted to Daniel. "I went to the beach yesterday," Daniel hollered back. Then Ben told Daniel, "Daniel, your brother is on YouTube." For a moment, Daniel wanted to start laughing at what Ben had just said. How could Samuel be on YouTube? Typically, Samuel tries to avoid the attention or spotlight. Instead, Daniel stuttered, Whoa, what do you mean?" "This guy, who has a YouTube channel, he's got like 2,600 subscribers, and, don't get mad, but, I subscribed to the video." Daniel felt a vicious surge of anger come over him. He'd known Ben had a phone since 3rd grade, and yeah, it would have been okay if Ben had watched the video, but he didn't have to subscribe. "Did you leave a comment?" Daniel shouted back, as he was dreading the answer. Samuel looked ready to punch the table. "Yes I did," Ben shouted back. "What is the video called?" Daniel shouted back. "Let me guess," Samuel snapped back loudly. "The Freak Surfer and the Shark?" Ben nodded and replied, "Yeah, that video has 557 views." Daniel felt so angry at Ben. How could his best friend betray him like this? Samuel turned furiously to Daniel. "You should drop him as a friend," Samuel snapped. "What, Ben?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Samuel snapped again. Ben was clearly trying to talk to Daniel again, but he was ignoring him. Before he decided to shut Ben out for good, Daniel wanted to ask one final question. "What comment did you leave?" "Oh," Ben shouted, "my comment was, please make more videos like that again." When Ben tried to say something else, Daniel ignored him for good this time because his brother came first, and if Samuel wanted him to drop Ben as a friend, by George, he would do it. When Samuel looked ready to shout at Daniel again, Annie laid a calming hand on his shoulder. It's not your brother's fault this is happening. Annie is right, Mom chimed in. But for the rest of the meal, Samuel decided to give death stares every now and then at Daniel. When they were walking out of the restaurant, Daniel made sure to slam his fist on Ben's table and he said furiously to his new ex-best friend, "We are freaking done as best friends." Ben watched a furious Daniel storm away from his table. What did I do wrong? Ben asked his father. His dad cleared his throat and said, well, look at it from his perspective. You watched a video of his brother being humiliated on YouTube without his permission and it was pretty obvious that your friend wouldn't have wanted you to comment and be supportive of his brother being embarrassed like that. Later that night at the Nathaniel household, Samuel, Daniel and Annie were up in their bedroom while Mom was downstairs cooking macaroni and cheese with barbecue ribs for dinner. Daniel and Samuel were in the middle of playing thumb war, meaning Samuel's anger with Daniel seemed to have cooled off. They had tried to convince Annie to play with them, but Annie kept insisting that she needed to read. A somewhat annoyed Daniel had told Annie that she had until the end of summer to read and might as well find some time to enjoy the summer. For once, Samuel seemed to be good at something Daniel wasn't because Samuel had beaten Daniel at thumb war about 36 times already and Daniel had only won twice. What do you think it will be like at Laura's house tomorrow? Annie asked, closing her book. After both boys had pretended to look surprised at Annie for closing her book, Annie had to kill the mood by saying, well duh. I can't keep my face hidden behind a book every second, of every minute, of every hour, of every day, of. Okay, what was your question? Samuel cut in. Annie repeated her question. No idea, Samuel responded immediately. For Daniel, his mind had wandered back to yesterday. He remembered how Ava kept mistreating Laura. Samuel waved a hand in front of Daniel's face to get his attention. Before Daniel could stop himself, he blurted out, I think we're going to have to listen to Ava snap at her daughter again and again. Samuel and Annie looked bemused. Daniel's expression must have mirrored his brother and sister's expression. Why does Ava keep snapping at Laura? Annie questioned. Daniel explained the whole scenario of when he had asked Mom the same thing and she had no idea how Ava could mistreat Laura that way. Daniel didn't know if it was coincidence or not, but just then Mom shouted from the kitchen, dinner is ready. Come and get it. 3 eager Nathaniels had raced downstairs, straight to the kitchen table. Before they could tear through their food like wild dogs, Mom held out her hands like stop signs. Ahem. Mom said. You know what I realized? No one said prayers at lunchtime and I will not have that happen at dinner time. Mom looked at Samuel. But Mom, no excuses, Mom had warned Samuel. Mom looked at Daniel, and Daniel you will say grace for breakfast tomorrow. Ah, Mom I am hungry, said Samuel as he reached for Daniel's hand, then he reached for Annie's hand, who both linked hands with Mom. Samuel began to say prayers. When Samuel finished saying grace Mom let them eat at last. So, Mom said as she started helping herself to some barbecue ribs. The boss might hold me in for an extra shift tomorrow. If that does end up happening, then you will have to stay at Laura's house until 8:30 p.m. Finally, after a long dinner of talking about what it might be like at Laura's house tomorrow, they raced upstairs to shower. When they each climbed into their beds, Mom kissed them good night and left the room. The next morning, someone gently pulled the covers from Daniel's sleeping profile. In mid-yawn, Daniel says, Hey, Samuel. Can't you ever wake me up the normal way? And it's early in the morning. As Daniel took a closer look, it was Annie not Samuel who had pulled the covers off of him. Samuel is brushing his teeth in the bathroom. Get dressed, Annie commanded as she tossed him some underwear, a red Minions t-shirt, and a pair of blue jeans. Get dressed, Annie demanded again as she clapped her hands for emphasis. Ah, thanks for waking me up early, snapped an extremely sleepy Daniel as he threw his nighttime shirt across the room. Well, I had to wake you up since Samuel is already brushing his teeth. But anyways, it's 7:30, she said pointing to Daniel's wristwatch, which was peeking out from underneath his pillow. Oh, yeah, Daniel said distractedly, maybe you're right. It was Daniel's turn to clap his hands as he added, Come on Ms. Wake me up early, let's go downstairs for breakfast. Annie gave him major side-eye as she went to follow him downstairs. Daniel and Annie groaned when they saw what was for breakfast. A second later, Samuel joined them downstairs. And not a moment too soon, he joined in the misery. Breakfast bar? 3 very shocked Nathaniels said in unison. For one, Mom said marching into the kitchen, "We are out of cereal." And 2, a breakfast bar has nutrients in it. And before you eat, without further sounds of complaint. I might add, Mom pointed a finger at Daniel. Ahem, it's time for some prayers. Daniel groaned and glared at Annie, just to have someone to glare at. When Daniel finished saying prayers, Annie had already finished her breakfast bar. Oh, Samuel glared at Annie. Annie ate her breakfast bar while Daniel said our morning prayers, snitched Samuel. Mom shot Annie a, "Please wait until your brother is done with prayers" look. When Samuel looked over at Daniel, he had already finished his bar as Samuel was being a tattletale on Annie. Mom shot Daniel a look as she muttered something underneath her breath that sounded a lot like, "Kids these days." When Samuel finally finished his breakfast bar, Mom told the kids to watch some TV while she went upstairs to shower. Mom also told them that they should start packing anything they wanted to take to Laura's house. But as soon as Mom left the room, the kids made a beeline straight to the television because that was the closest thing to an electronic they were allowed to have. Mom mainly stuck to her phone and rarely watched TV. Oh, can we please watch Harry Potter? Annie asked. But Daniel dived for the remote that was lying on the couch. He started flipping through the channels, noticeably not going on Disney Plus either. Annie was begging incisively to watch Harry Potter. "Come on Daniel, let's watch some Pennywise," Samuel said over Annie's repetitive chanting. "Great idea," Daniel shouted back to Samuel. You realize that Mom is going to kill us when she realizes, right?" Annie shouts to Daniel. It was true, one time Mom had caught them watching it and she went ballistic. As punishment, Mom had banned them from watching TV for an entire 2 weeks. To her it was way too violent and horrifying. Annie had tried protesting that she had her eyes covered the entire time, hoping Mom would let her off the hook, but she was mistaken. "Don't worry," said Daniel. "Eek," Annie squealed, "I am going upstairs to pack anything I might want to take to Laura's house." Annie snapped as she fled the living room and stomped upstairs. The boys, however, didn't waste any of their precious time talking about Annie, and got straight to it. Daniel started typing in the movie It into Netflix. As the movie began, Samuel asked Daniel, "Do you have a plan to avoid getting in trouble when Mom gets out of the shower?" "Yes," Daniel says to Samuel as he explains his plan. When Mom was drying off with her towel in the bathroom, she usually sang one of Fallon's favorite songs at the top of her lungs, which the neighbors were sure to hear. One of Fallon's favorite songs was "On and On" by Cartoon. So while Mom began her song at the top of her lungs, that was their cue to turn off the TV and run upstairs as if they had been up there the entire time. Daniel and Samuel had jumped around as they saw the scene with George and his final moments as the clown went in for the kill. 12 minutes later, Mom began to sing a song by Ariana Grande. Daniel decided to quickly type Harry Potter into Disney Plus, as if they could deceive Mom into thinking they had been watching it the whole time if she chose to check their viewing history. Then when he turned off the TV and threw the remote back onto the couch, Samuel gave Daniel a big smirk and a thumbs up. "Are you guys done watching it?" Annie snapped angrily. "Be quiet, Annie," Daniel whispered before he quickly filled Annie in on their deception. Annie looked disgusted as Daniel finished. She sat up so fast that 4 of the books that she had on her lap fell in a heap onto the floor. "I am telling Mom," Annie snapped at her brothers. After what felt like 20 hours, Daniel and Samuel managed to convince Annie to keep her mouth shut about their diabolical scheme. It was just in the nick of time too, because 2 minutes later Mom had walked into the room fully dressed. She asked if they had anything they wanted to take to Laura's house, but all 3 of them said simultaneously, "Nope." Mom told them to put on their shoes and meet her outside next to the car. Finally, when all 3 kids jumped into the Highlander, Mom put the car into overdrive and headed to Laura's house. "So," Mom said as the first 5 minutes had slowly crawled by, "what do you guys plan on doing at Laura's house today?" "Playing GTA 5, Daniel said. "Oh, please," It's not like Laura is going to have video games at her house, Annie said. I am talking about her brothers, Daniel said. Well, Mom said from the front seat, Ava lets her kids stay up as long as they want. So, it will probably be very quiet when we get there, okay? Okay, everyone answered. Are you saying they went to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning? Samuel questioned. Most nights they do, when they feel like staying up late, that is, Mom said, twiddling with the radio. Then she started playing an audiobook. Finally, when they arrived at Laura's house, Mom knocked on the door and the doorbell made a ding-dong sound. Daniel caught a glimpse of a security camera nearby. At first, no one answered the door, then the second time she knocked, a puffy-eyed Laura opened the door. Who are you guys? Laura asked through a yawn. I am Daniel, this is Samuel, and that's Annie. We are the ones who will be staying with you for about a month. Daniel says with a quizzical look. Laura rubbed her eyes, then she seemed to recognize them. Where is your mom? Asked Melanie. Asleep, Laura sighed. At least your mom will know I dropped off my kids, while she was sleeping. Then Mom waved her kids over for a Nathaniel family hug. After she kisses each of the kids on the forehead, Mom says, behave yourselves today, bye. Goodbye, Daniel, Annie, and Samuel said in unison as they waved goodbye to their mom. Mom waved back as she ran back to the car. Then she jumped into the car and drove away. Laura waved them each inside, then gently closed the door behind them. Laura told them they needed to be quiet because her mom was a grumpy riser. She also added, she is always mad at me for everything I do, but when it comes to Nate and Ethan, they get freaking praise no matter what. One time, Nate drew all over the bathroom wall, and even though Mom checked the security cameras, she blamed me. Even though she saw with her own 2 eyes that it was clearly Nate. When Laura led them into the living room, Daniel, Samuel, and Annie saw Ava deep asleep on the couch, which wasn't the craziest part. Ava's phone laid on the floor as though she had pushed it on the floor in her sleep, and she had earbuds in, like she had fallen asleep listening to something. Should we wake her up? Asked an extremely timid Annie. Laura quickly shook her head. Nah, the longer she is asleep, the happier I will be. I mean, she is always blaming me for things Nate and Ethan do. Everyone quickly tiptoed quietly around Ava and made their way upstairs. Laura's bedroom appeared to be the first bedroom throughout a long hallway. Laura explained the second door to the left from Laura's bedroom was the bathroom. The third door down the hall was Ethan and Nate's bedroom. When they were in Laura's bedroom, a phone was perched on her bed playing something. Oh, that is my story animated on YouTube playing on my phone, Laura said as she caught Daniel's puzzled expression. My Story Animated is the best YouTube channel I know. What is My Story Animated? Asked Annie. Laura explained that it was about random people's lives that were filled with disaster, drama, and deception. What do your brothers think of My Story Animated? Samuel asked. They think it is insane, but I don't care what they think. Laura said indifferently. Laura grinned. One time, Ethan dressed up as one of the MSA girls out of spite, thinking it would upset me, and he ended up falling down the stairs and fracturing his hand. Which serves him right for making fun of MSA. No one makes fun of it and gets away with it. Laura scoffed. Daniel and Samuel cracked up, forgetting to keep their voices quiet for a moment. Was Ethan okay? Annie asked. Daniel and Samuel immediately stopped laughing. Of course, Annie had to go and ruin the moment by asking if Ethan was okay. Honestly, Annie, Laura began, I don't care if he was okay or not, but unfortunately he made a full recovery. I wish he would have broken his foot or something. Laura started taking deep breaths and then she asked if they could stop talking about her mom and her brothers because talking about anyone in her family made her very keen to grab them and push them into the ocean. Samuel, Daniel, and Annie nodded. Just then, the door to her bedroom opened and a boy with a red shirt and a sleepy expression on his face walked in. The boy walked over to Laura, completely ignored the Nathaniels, and snatched her phone. You tricked me. The boy snapped at Laura. You said your phone was freaking dead. Laura looked panicked and at a loss for what to say next. The Nathaniels looked at the boy nervously. Also, why did you tell these 3 about Ethan? The boy said, pointing to the 3 Nathaniels. The boy pretended to smash Laura's phone. The three Nathaniels seemed to have put the pieces together and figured this obnoxious boy had to be Nate. As Nate pretended to smash Laura's phone again, Laura seemed to get back her strength and lunged at Nate for her phone. Nate, however, dodged her pitiful attempt effortlessly. So instead of lunging at him and getting her phone back as Laura had imagined, she went crashing into the wall. Nate cracked up with laughter. He nearly fell to the floor with his laughter. I swear that is the best surprise you have given me since 2021. Thank you sis for making my day, Nate said, laughing hysterically as he left the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. Samuel was the one to help Laura up. Laura gritted her teeth as she suddenly went into a full-blown rant about Nate being a tyrant. Daniel could hear the faint sounds of Nate waking up Ethan and telling him everything. Nate was telling Ethan about Laura spilling the beans about him fracturing his hand. Ethan shouted, clearly and loudly, "Oh, you are so freaking going to pay for that, Laura." "Are you okay?" asked Annie. Laura replied, "I am fine, I am used to Ethan." Just then, the door flew wide open with a wall-shaking crash. Daniel, Annie, and Samuel all scrambled onto Laura's bed, convinced that they had never heard such a loud bang in their lives. Standing in the doorway, gritting her teeth, was Ava. "How dare you wake me up?" shouted Ava to Laura. "And if you dare talk back to me, you will be grounded for 2 weeks. Furthermore, what makes you think you can just let people into our home?" As she glanced at the three Nathaniels, Daniel and Annie cowered underneath her glare, convinced Ava was going to launch a tyrant rant at them. Surprisingly, Ava said in a much calmer tone, "No offense to you three. I know your mom must have dropped you off while I was sleeping." Turning back to Laura, she began shouting, "Give me your phone." "But Nate has it," Laura said, shrugging her shoulders. "Well, in that case, they are allowed to have your phone. Now I am going to head downstairs to make breakfast." She slammed the door as she began to stomp downstairs. Samuel, Daniel, Annie, and Laura could hear the sounds of Nate and Ethan roaring with laughter. Then Nate's voice echoed loudly down the hall, "Man, she is just full of surprises today. First she ended up crashing into the wall to get her phone back, then she got Mom to yell at her. Now come on Ethan, let's play on the Nintendo Switch." "I didn't know your brothers were that mean," Annie said to Laura. "They can be much more brutal, trust me," sighed Laura. "What happened in 2021? Samuel asked. "Nothing," Laura said. It was clear she didn't want to talk about it. 30 minutes later, Ava shouted, "Breakfast is ready. Come downstairs and get it." Everyone headed downstairs, but strangely enough, Ethan and Nate had a gadget in their hands, not bothering to pay attention to where they were going. When Laura caught Annie's confused stare, she said, "They always carry a gadget wherever they go. FYI, even to the beach." Ethan suddenly retorted, "At least Mom allows us to stay home. When you guys went to the beach, we were here at home, alone. Why she didn't take you to the underworld and leave you there, is a mystery to me. That should clearly show you that Mom loves us more than she loves you." Ethan then bolted down the last couple of stairs, his Nintendo still in his hands, and ran into the kitchen. Finally, when everyone was at the breakfast table, Ava served them eggs and bacon with a cup of iced tea. Ethan and Nate got coffee instead of tea. "What grade are you guys in?" Samuel asked Ethan and Nate. "Ninth grade," said Ethan. "Finishing up high school," said Nate. Samuel and Daniel linked hands with Annie, ready to say morning prayers. Surprisingly, Laura, Ethan, Nate, and Ava just started eating. Suddenly, Ava looked over at the three Nathaniels. "Oh, we're just about to say grace," Samuel said as he caught Ava staring at them. Ava cleared her throat. "Well, since you are guests, it is okay for you guys to stick to your prayers. I would allow the boys to say prayers, but they just don't want to." And Laura stopped trying to reach over to grab Samuel's hand. "Otherwise you won't have breakfast. Your horrible father could never say prayers." Laura immediately withdrew her hand from Samuel's, surprised that her mom even took notice of her actions. Halfway through breakfast, shockingly, Ethan turned off his Switch, turned to both Daniel and Samuel and asked, "Do you want to play Mario Brothers or Call of Duty?" Daniel and Samuel both knew that those were video games. Oh, can I play?" Annie piped up. Annie didn't listen as Laura whispered, "They're not going to let you." "No. Nate says, turning off Laura's phone. Since you are a girl, you are not allowed to play. Tears pricked Annie's eyes, she turned away trying to cover them. Daniel and Samuel glared at Ethan and Nate, snapping at them in perfect unison. They say, "We are not playing video games with you guys. How dare you make our sister cry?" Nate and Ethan put their heads together and started whispering rapidly. 4 seconds later, Ethan and Nate were doing hand gestures to each other. Finally, when 2 whole minutes had passed, Ethan got off his chair and walked over to Annie. "What do you want?" Annie angrily snapped at them. Ethan patted Annie on her back. "Nate didn't mean a thing he said." "What is your name?" "Annie," she replied. "Well, yes," Ethan said, "you guys can all play with us." "Like I said, Nate didn't mean a thing he said." Then Ethan walked back to his chair and sat down. Daniel and Samuel knew the only reason they were apologizing was because, for some strange reason, they wanted the Nathaniels to play with them. Clearly, Annie wasn't realizing that their apology had an ulterior motive. "What kind of video games can we play?" Annie asked happily. Nate tried to stifle his laugh as he told Annie, "Well, my favorite video game is Zelda. For some reason, my brother likes to play Mario all the time." Laura looked outraged, but no one looked her way for the rest of breakfast. When breakfast was over, Ethan, Nate, and Ava gave all their plates to Laura, as if it was her responsibility to wash their dishes. Ava snatched the Nathaniel's plates and handed it to Laura as well. Suddenly the 2 older boys ran upstairs as if this was a normal occurrence, to not wash their plates. Just then, Ethan shouted, "Come on you 3, let's play video games." They glanced at Ava, then Daniel asked, "Why don't you guys wash your own dishes?" "Why does Laura have to do it?" "Because I told her to," Ava said without hesitation. "Can we help?" Annie asked. Samuel snorted, "Help her yourself. I am going upstairs to play video games with them." Daniel looked shocked. "Well," Ava began, "you should head upstairs to play video games, not wasting your time down here helping Laura." "Can we help though?" Daniel persisted as Annie nodded her head vigorously behind him. Ava sighed, "I don't know why you 2 bother, but go ahead." Then Ava walked upstairs. "Can you believe it?" Annie whispered to Daniel. "I know. I never thought Samuel would do such a thing." "Oh, I'm not talking about that, but that was shocking." Annie says to Daniel, "I wonder what else they make Laura do other than wash their dishes." Annie says. Daniel and Annie took some of the dishes from Laura and began helping her. Laura still looked outraged. "How could they say yes to you guys but not me?" "Where is Samuel?" she snaps. Laura quickly added, Oh, never mind. He's probably upstairs playing video games with my idiot brothers." Before Laura could burst into any further rants, Daniel laid a hand on her shoulder. "We are helping you wash the dishes, are we not?" Then Annie added, "Yeah, what our brother did was shocking, but at least we didn't agree with him." After counting to 147, Laura calmed down. Daniel leaned toward her with an idea brewing in his mind. "Next time Ethan and Nate ask you to get them a drink, why don't you put something into their drink?" Annie and Laura both looked shocked at what Daniel just said. Seeing their faces, Daniel added, "Why don't you put chili powder into their drinks?" He suddenly jumped on the counter and rifled through the cabinets. Finally, Daniel found what he was looking for, a jar of chili powder. Daniel held it out in front of Laura. Waiting, and guess what? Waiting for her to take it. After hesitating for what seemed like forever, she took it. It would be nice to teach them a lesson. Laura said more to herself. Exactly. Daniel begins as he places his hand on his hips posing as a superhero. You just have to be brave about it. Who cares if they suspect you? Who cares if you get grounded? Take that with a grain of salt. When Daniel was finished, Laura says, "But you never have seen them extremely angry or upset." Daniel jumped down from the counter and gripped Laura's shoulder. "You are not supposed to focus on that, just focus on your potential victory. And if your mom grounds you, just tell her you don't care." Daniel could practically see the wheels turning in Laura's mind. The 3 of them started walking upstairs, after they cleaned the dishes and cleaned the kitchen counters. Laura had barely opened the door to her bedroom when Ethan burst out of his and Nate's room. "Hey, I thought you guys were going to play video games with us." I'm not talking to you though, Laura. Laura sighed violently and slammed her door. Daniel and Annie gleefully rushed to their bedroom to play with them. The moment Ethan closed the door behind them, Daniel stormed up to his brother, who was playing Zelda with Nate, and snatched the controller. Annie marched up behind him, looking just as furious. Daniel snapped, "You could have helped me," and Annie helped Laura wash the freaking dishes, you know. Samuel shot him an infuriated glare. "I didn't want to help you guys wash the dishes because playing video games is much more interesting." Ethan applauded, "Woo-hoo, we don't need a Nathaniel brother rumble right now." "Why won't you guys let Laura play with you?" asked Annie. Nate sighed and stuck his index finger in his ears, "La la 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 la." Ethan was the one to answer though, because we never allow Laura to play with us. Plus she doesn't even like to play video games. Ethan led Daniel and Annie over to the edge of his bed, and pointed to his Nintendo. "What game do you guys want to play?" "How about Mario?" Daniel suggested before Annie could get a word out. "How about 1, 2, Switch?" Annie suggested. "How do you know I even have that?" Ethan questioned. "I don't. I'm simply throwing out suggestions." "Well, you're actually in luck. I do have 1, 2, Switch for my Nintendo," Ethan said with a smirking smile as he powered up his Nintendo. "Wait, what about playing Mario?" Daniel asked disappointedly. "Nah, it's my Nintendo and we're playing 1, 2, Switch. And that is final." The first game they played was Ethan's favorite, Sword Fight. Even though Ethan claimed he was better than Nate at this game, Daniel beat Ethan in literally less than a minute. They ended up playing 2 more games on the Nintendo, Wizard and Baseball, when the door to the bedroom opened. Laura walked into their bedroom looking nervous, biting her lower lip. Suddenly she blurted out to Nate, "Can you give me my freaking phone back?" Nate, however, shook his head. "Are you bored?" Laura tried sneaking her phone away from him, and when that didn't work, she tried groveling. Then Ethan intervened, snapping at Laura, "When mommy grounded you, she said that your phone will be taken away for a day. So, technically, we don't have to give it back. Now, out skis." Both Nate and Ethan threw Laura out the door. Ethan slammed the door shut and Nate made sure to lock it right after. As Ethan makes his way to the Nathaniels again, Annie says, "Couldn't you just give Laura her phone back?" Ethan shook his head and replied, "Nope. We are having way too much fun." He and Nate shared a quick look before he looked back at Annie. "It's so fun making her jealous. Remember Nate, the look on her face at breakfast?" She looked outraged. "So that's why you wanted to play video games with me, and my brothers?" snapped a furious Annie. Samuel shot Daniel and Annie a quick gleeful grin. "Nate told me I could play all I want. So you two can play with the little lamb and we can continue to play video games. Now, get out." Daniel and Annie raced to the door. Daniel was the one to unlock it. "Wait, guys." The door slammed shut, drowning out the last of Ethan's words. Daniel turned furiously to Annie. "Who does Samuel think he is? I swear he's changing by just being around those two." Annie's eyes were fixated on the floor. "I don't know what's gotten into Samuel either," said Annie, her voice sounding hoarse. 2 hours later, Ava called them downstairs for lunch. The Nathaniels linked hands to say prayers. Surprisingly, Laura joined in and Samuel was willing to say grace, despite his attitude earlier. Ava glared at Laura. Before she could get a word out, Daniel said, "How do you make this spaghetti and garlic bread taste so good?" Ava's eyes turned a tiny bit dreamy as she told Daniel, "When I was at school, I could cook better than the lunch ladies." Even though she was foul towards Laura, her food was delicious. Of course, Nate and Ethan were still on their gadgets, but Ethan wasn't on his Nintendo. It must have been his actual phone that he was on. For dessert, after everyone was done with lunch, Ava served them donuts. Daniel, Annie, and Samuel gaped in surprise. Ava gave them a sweet grin. "Pick your flavor. You get 2 each." Normally, Daniel would have been full by now, but those medium-sized powdered donuts had killed any protest he might have had. Ethan picked 2 strawberry donuts, Nate picked 2 chocolate donuts. Daniel picked out 2 powdered donuts before anyone could snatch them. Annie picked out 2 glazed donuts. Samuel and Laura each got the last strawberry donuts. After lunch, Laura washed the dishes with Annie and Daniel. Samuel, Ethan, and Nate rushed back upstairs. Later that day, Daniel and Annie were playing cards with Laura in her bedroom. Daniel was still mad at Samuel for not even bothering to help Laura with cleaning up. Daniel could hear the sounds of Ethan and Nate and Samuel playing video games as loud as they could. About an hour later, Laura offered to give her phone to Daniel and Annie. "Let's watch some My Story animated," says Annie. They watched the most recent video of MSA. Surprisingly, Daniel didn't cringe at watching a girly-type video. Just then, Samuel burst into the room. "Can I join you guys?" Daniel leapt to his feet. "You can forget that," shouted Daniel. Annie laid a calming hand on his shoulder. "Of course you can join us." Laura nodded in agreement. Daniel cursed underneath his breath, but Samuel didn't even help clean up. Samuel shoved Daniel aside and sat between Laura and Annie. Around 7:30 p.m., Ava called them all downstairs for dinner. Chicken nuggets and fries, with a side of ketchup, was what Ava made for dinner. After dinner, for dessert, Ava served mint Oreos. After washing the dishes, surprisingly Samuel helped this time. They raced upstairs after finishing up to watch more MSA videos. "Hey Annie," says Laura, "look at the scene in this video." But Annie had jumped to her feet. She didn't even bother looking at anyone as she bolted out of the room. "What the?" Samuel began. A few seconds later, Annie burst back into the bedroom, looking worried. "Annie, what's up?" Daniel asked. After a few moments of silence, Annie finally said, "I just realized that it has gotten super dark outside and Mom hasn't arrived yet. I ran downstairs to ask Ava what time it was. She checked her phone and you know what she said?" "What did she say?" Samuel asked. "It's 8:50 p.m. Daniel had felt like someone dropped a brick on his head. Then Samuel chimed in, "Mom is never late." Annie nodded, too shocked to finish her train of thought, so Daniel finished it for her. "She was supposed to be here 20 minutes ago." "Man, I feel like such a brickhead for not worrying about Mom," said Samuel. Laura was the one trying to console everyone. "Don't worry guys. Maybe she stopped at the gas station to get gas, or drinks, or snacks, or something." You know? Daniel thought that theory was far-fetched. He knew for a fact that the car was full of gas that morning. Besides, Mom always had drinks and snacks with her when she went to work. Laura looked at each of the Nathaniel's skeptical faces and she tried coming up with something else to say. "Why don't we play hide and seek as a distraction?" she suggested. After a long period of silence, Daniel, Samuel, and Annie laughed angrily. Laura tried to convince them it was a good way to distract them. Maybe after a couple of rounds, their mom would be here before they knew it. The three of them reluctantly agreed in the end. An hour had gone by after playing a couple of rounds of hide and seek, but Daniel had been getting restless. So while Laura was counting to 47, Daniel snuck out of the bathroom cabinet he had been hiding in and bolted downstairs, finding Ava downstairs. She was watching some sort of cartoon on TV. "What is it, Daniel?" she asked when she noticed him. Daniel told Ava about how his mom was extremely late and how she was supposed to be there at 8:30 p.m. Daniel finished his sentence with, "Ava, can you please call my mom on her phone?" Ava nodded, giving Daniel a sympathetic glance. Daniel leaned in closer to Ava's phone, hoping Mom would answer her phone. Surprisingly, Ava looked like she was hoping for the same thing. Daniel couldn't tell who looked more disappointed when Mom didn't answer her freaking phone. Although, Daniel was pretty sure it was him, considering it was his mom after all. Ava tried to console Daniel as well. "Don't worry son, maybe your mom got held up at work." Daniel didn't think so, but he thanked Ava for trying as he slumped upstairs. Daniel sat at the top of the stairs feeling scared and angry. Just then, Laura found him. "Daniel, the stairs are an obvious place not to hide." Daniel told Laura about how Ava tried calling his mom but got no answer. Just then, Annie and Samuel seemed to melt out of the shadows, with gloomy faces. They must have overheard their conversation. Samuel and Annie looked just as scared and angry as Daniel felt. Laura mumbled something about how she wished Melanie was her mom and Ava was the Nathaniel's mom, but Daniel was in no mood to hear about Laura's ridiculous mommy issues. He was too concerned with the whereabouts of his mom. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Daniel, Samuel, and Annie all shared a glance. Could that be their freaking mom? All three of them bolted down the stairs to the door. Surprisingly, Ava had beat them to the door. Mom stood in the doorway. They each threw themselves at her and hugged her. "Why are you late?" all three of them shouted, demanding to know why. "Well, the boss held me back for an even longer shift than I had imagined," said Mom warily. Daniel thought that was a straight-up lie, even though he didn't voice that to her. Mom turned towards Ava to thank her for watching the kids all day. Ava swore it was nothing at all and the kids were well behaved the entire day. They all said goodbye to each other, then they turned towards the car, not leaving Mom's side. Finally, when they got home, Daniel, Samuel, and Annie each took their showers and climbed into bed. As their mom was kissing Samuel goodnight, Daniel demanded to know and blurted out, "Why didn't you answer your phone when Ava called you?" "I had my phone turned off because Josh and I." Suddenly Mom looked horrified at her tiny slip. Suddenly the kids demanded to know who this Josh was. Mom quickly added that Josh was just a friend from work. She rushed the good nights and practically ran out of the room. They couldn't get their minds off this Josh person and Mom's weird behavior. Before they drifted off to sleep, Daniel said, "Man, this whole summer seems like a mystery." Several days had passed with the same schedule. The Nathaniels woke up, ate breakfast, showered, then went to Laura's house. The one day, when Mom dropped the kids off at Laura's, they were surprised to find both Ethan and Nate awake. Ethan looked furious and was yelling something about someone taking his phone. Just then, Ava and Laura came downstairs. "Do you know where my phone is?" Laura asked them as she approached. The three Nathaniels stepped back, wondering what was going on. Daniel, Annie, and Samuel shook their heads. Ethan muttered something about how he still thought Laura had been the culprit this entire time. Laura shouted, "For the last flippin' time, this isn't my fault. You guys turned my room upside down looking for your phone. Plus, why would I want your phone when I have my own phone?" Ava glared at Laura. 5 minutes later, Ava gave her phone to Ethan because they still weren't able to find his phone. Laura was looking gloomy though. She and the Nathaniels were sitting on her bed in her bedroom. "It had to be Nate," Daniel said for the 100th time. Laura shook her head. "It couldn't be him because he doesn't have a phone. And anyway, if he stole my phone, then he wouldn't be able to enjoy the satisfaction of forcing me to give him my phone. And Ethan doesn't really care about my phone, so it couldn't be him either. Lastly, there is no way Nate would steal Ethan's phone." During dinner, Ethan was still sulking about his missing phone. 2 days later, it was Saturday. Mom decided that it would be fun to take the kids to the beach again. Surprisingly, she let the boys surf after what happened to Samuel the first time. Daniel would have expected an overprotective vibe. On Sunday, Mom took them to the pizza place again for lunch. When Daniel entered the pizza place, he felt a sudden pang of sadness. This is where he and Ben had their big fight, but lunch drove any thoughts about Ben out of his head. Then the next day at Laura's house, Daniel would have expected Ethan and Laura to find their phones by now, but he was sorely mistaken. Their phones were still missing. Ethan was more annoyed because it seemed like Ava was getting a call every 7 minutes, which meant he couldn't use her phone. And every time Nate told Ethan that he had YouTube on his Nintendo, Nate always got the same response: "It just isn't the same." Laura was trying to hide it, but they could all tell. Laura was annoyed about her phone missing. Every time the Nathaniels tried to talk to her about it, Laura always referred to it as someone stealing her phone. "For the 400th time already, maybe someone was just borrowing it," Daniel said. "They should have returned it by now," Laura snapped. Later that day at lunch, Daniel noticed Ethan watching YouTube on his Nintendo. Nate was, however, still sulking. Since Laura's phone was missing, Nate couldn't watch another show. Daniel wondered if his phone would disappear if he ever got one. Later that night when Mom picked them up, on time this time, Mom gave them some shocking news in the car on the way home. The Nathaniels only had to spend 4 more days left at Laura's and then, finally, they could spend the rest of the summer with Mom. Even though Samuel tried to hide it, he couldn't help but clap in happiness. Sure, it was disappointing that they couldn't spend more time with Laura. But hey, they could spend the rest of the summer with their flippin' mama. The Nathaniels whooped and hollered in joy. The next 4 days passed in slow agony. Daniel could have sworn the clocks were bewitched somehow to go extremely slow. For example, lunchtime on Tuesday, Daniel could have sworn an extra 10 minutes was added to the clock. Melanie and Ava had a late FaceTime call last night. Now that Ava knew the Nathaniels would be staying for 4 more days, she was trying to make it super fun. She took everyone to the park, and even got some ice cream. Surprisingly, Ava wasn't even being foul to Laura, mostly ignoring her, but hey, it was an improvement. Laura seemed more than happy with this new arrangement. Daniel had to admit he was having fun. Even Ethan and Nate were trying to make the Nathaniels feel included. Annie told Samuel and Daniel that she was not going to play with Ethan or Nate unless they included Laura. Samuel didn't look that thrilled to take a stand to his new friends, but he reluctantly agreed with Annie. Of course, Daniel had immediately agreed with Annie from the beginning. So when Ethan and Nate asked the Nathaniels to play video games with them, Annie was the one to be firm and hard on them. Daniel nodded as Annie spoke, but Samuel mostly shrank back. Only if you include Laura, snapped Annie. Immediately Ethan and Nate put their heads together and started whispering. And no ulterior motives either, said Annie. Finally, they made up their minds. Ethan looked like he would rather wilt in the sun as he told Annie, "Go get Laura." Annie jumped with joy in the air. "You're including her?" Nate nodded. "Do not make us repeat ourselves again. Hurry up and go get Laura, before we change our minds," snapped Nate. 5 minutes later, Nate, Ethan, Daniel, Annie, Samuel, and Laura were all in the bedroom. Apparently Ethan hadn't lied when he said that Laura was not interested in playing video games. Laura sat in a corner reading a book, and, of course, since Annie enjoyed books more than video games, she joined Laura in the corner. Despite Ethan's protest, we included Laura, and just because she doesn't want to join in doesn't mean that you should back out. Come on, play video games with us. But Annie instead joined Laura. Finally their mom arrived to pick them up about 4 hours later. The next morning at breakfast, Mom told the kids as she helped herself to corn flakes. Ava said to bring some swimming trunks. Daniel felt like he had enough water to last 3 lifetimes. They had gone to the beach twice in one summer. When Mom added that it was a surprise, Daniel tried guessing what it could be. The beach? But Mom told him, "You will see." Later, as Mom was showering, the Nathaniels were in the bedroom. They all agreed that they were over all the water events for the summer. They knew they were on their way to another day at the beach. Annie was very enthusiastic about the surprise. She had a pair of swimming trunks lying next to her as she flipped through the pages of another book. When they got to Laura's house, Ava wouldn't reveal the surprise just yet. After lunch, Ava told Laura, Ethan, and Nate to go change into their swimming trunks. Then when they left to go change, Daniel, Samuel, and Annie all guessed at the same time, but she said it wasn't the beach. By the time Ethan, Nate, and Laura came back downstairs and put their shoes on, it was time to go. The car wasn't the cleanest that the Nathaniels had gotten into. Papers were scattered all over the floor and seats of the car. A soda can lay on the floor. Newspapers were scattered all over the back seat. Well, the point is that it looked like a hurricane had gone on a rampage in the car. When Ava noticed the look on Annie, Samuel, and Daniel's puzzled stares, Ava went pink in the face and said, "Oh, well, I don't take real good care of my car." Ethan added, "Every time we kids eat in the car, we don't really take our trash out of the car." Then once they got in the car, it smelled like cigarettes and the Nathaniels jumped once Ava started the car and the music blasted through the speakers. Nate, Ethan, and Laura didn't bother covering their ears. It might have been because they were used to the noise. Ava glanced in the back seat at the Nathaniels, and shouted, "Do you want me to turn down the volume?" Daniel's mouth opened and he shouted as loud as he could, "Please turn down the volume." Ava quickly turned the volume down. When she had turned down the volume, it was the kind of music that Ava loved to listen to. Daniel knew if he ever told Mom what kind of music Ava had been listening to right in front of them, she would have had an epic freak out. Ava loved listening to "I Got Murder on My Mind" or "Ambition for Cash." Daniel couldn't wait for Ava to turn off the music, even though he wasn't a fan of some of the cursing going on in the songs. Finally, they arrived, but Daniel's mouth dropped open, along with Samuel and Annie. They were not at a flipping beach like they thought. Instead they were at a water park. Even though the Nathaniels might be over the whole water scene for the remainder of the summer, they agreed that it might be more fun at the water park. They can do cannonballs, go on the lazy river, and slide down the water slides. When they were on their way to the locker rooms to put some sunscreen on, Ethan started going on and on about this new water slide that they just found out about a month ago. As they entered the locker room, there was a crunchy sound underneath Annie's feet. Annie bent down to see what it was and nearly gagged. It was flippin' dog poop, hardened in the heat of the sun. Ethan had stepped in dog poop as well. Ethan cursed and got it off quickly. Daniel turned to Ava and asked, "How many pieces of dog poop is there on the sidewalk?" Daniel couldn't hear what Ava had really said, but it sounded as if she was muttering something about bringing untrained idiotic hounds to the water park. Finally, when all of them had sunscreen on, everyone, especially Ethan and Nate, wanted to go on the deep end. So Ava started heading that way, mainly for the sake of Ethan, Nate, and the Nathaniels. If it had just been Laura who had wanted to go to the deep end, Daniel would have bet all of his mom's salary that Ava would have shot that idea down quickly. At first, everyone was mainly interested in having a swimming contest. Even Ava joined in. Then everyone started getting excited about who can hold their breath the longest. There were 2 teams, for the first round Ethan, Annie, and Daniel with Ava as the counter. Daniel won that round. Daniel had come to the surface when Ava had reached the number 39. A laughing Laura had told him that Ethan had come up before she even got to the number 2. Apparently Annie had come up around the 22-second mark, which meant Daniel was the clear winner. A very angry Ava swam over to Laura and slapped her full on the face without warning. "Don't tell lies about Ethan or else you will be grounded for a whole year," shouted Ava. "But it's true," Laura said, sulking as she held her face in her hands where her mom had slapped her. Ava looked like she was struggling to restrain herself from dunking Laura under the water. She cleared her throat loudly and said, "All right, team number 2. Daniel, Ethan, and Annie turned to Nate and Laura. It took Daniel a few seconds to realize someone was missing. Where did Samuel flippin' go? Apparently, Nate thought it was a good idea to shove Samuel underwater. Nate had swam around for a bit thinking he was the funniest guy in town. Then Nate realized what he had done. He went over to the place where he had shoved Samuel underwater and tried to pull him up. That's when he realized Samuel had disappeared. Daniel felt like knocking Nate out. Samuel had a disaster with the water once at the beach. It was like the water hated Samuel. Daniel shouted at Nate, "You killed my brother, you." Even Ava looked furious as her shouts cut Daniel off. "You disgraceful excuse for a male. How do you think Melanie will react when she realizes one of her kids is missing?" Then Ava started shouting about Nate being a disgrace to her in front of those around them. Even Laura looked surprised about this. For once Ava was shouting at someone that wasn't her. Ava quickly made them each get out of the water to look for Samuel. Ava had Daniel describe Samuel to her. Daniel was so angry that he didn't care that he snapped at Ava. "How can you not remember? You can always remember to ground Laura for no reason." Since Ava couldn't remember, Daniel described Samuel to each person they had approached to see if they saw him. Daniel's heart sank when the last girl denied seeing him. Daniel, Ava, Annie, Laura, Ethan, and Nate had looked high and low throughout the locker rooms, and, still, no Samuel. Daniel now felt worried about Samuel. Where had he disappeared to? And why had he disappeared? And why had Nate, the idiot, shoved him under the water? Laura suggested that they all should look near the water slides. Annie's voice sounded hoarse. "If Samuel isn't there, who knows where he is?" When they got to the water slides, the line was packed and people were getting angry that Daniel was shoving through the middle of them. Finally a man got angry when Daniel shoved his wife aside and he grabbed Daniel by the scruff of his neck, demanding to know why Daniel was shoving people out of the way. Ava rushed forward and wham! She had punched the man right in the face. His grip on Daniel loosened and he fell to the ground, but quickly got to his feet. Ava drew back her fist as if she was going to punch him again. The man looked ready to fight back, but his wife grabbed his hand and yanked him towards her as she forced him to walk away. Daniel fumed at Nate. This was all his fault. For once, Nate looked ashamed at his own existence. Even Ethan looked mad at Nate for what could only be the first time. That was my best friend you shoved under the water, you disgraceful excuse for a brother. Daniel's eyes jumped wide open, and he told everyone they should search in the water park. But Annie asked, if Samuel was in the water the whole time, wouldn't he have drowned by now? Daniel tried not to think about that as he told Annie, maybe he swam to the surface and got out of the pool looking for us when he didn't see us. Daniel was grasping at every straw of hope he could find. Ava was on board with that idea, as she divided everyone into groups. Ava was taking Annie and Laura, while Daniel was grouped with Mr. Drown, my brother, and Ethan. Ava said her group was going to look in the shallow end, and their group was to check the deep end again. Daniel was quite pleased, and a little surprised, that Ava wasn't going to check the deep end. Though she did seem more careless than Mom to have kids check the deep end. Good luck, Ava said to the boys. Then she, Annie, and Laura vanished into the crowd. Daniel thought about shoving Nate in fact his hand was on Nate's back ready to shove him in when a freaking lifeguard approached them and started telling him off. His name tag read Noah. As Noah was going on and on about safety measures and that pushing people in was not allowed here, Daniel suddenly cut across him. Daniel had had enough. If he didn't get to Samuel now, he probably might be dead. So Daniel angrily said to Noah, "You're yelling at me for trying to shove him in, when this is the guy that shoved my missing brother under the water. So where were you when all of this happened?" Noah went pink in the face, but Daniel was fed up and shoved him aside. Daniel restrained himself from seeking any form of justice on Nate. Daniel, Ethan, and Nate jumped in. After swimming around for a few moments like foolish fish, Daniel had enough and raised his voice higher than the entire water park. "Samuel, if you can hear me," but Daniel stopped. He didn't know if Samuel could hear him. Nate glanced at Ethan, Daniel turned to both of them and said, "Let's all shout Samuel's name." Together, all three of them raised their voices in unison, "Samuel. Samuel. Samuel." After a few seconds, nothing happened. Then Daniel said that they should look at separate sides of the deep end. Ethan thought that was a great idea and he would join Daniel. They both agreed, since none of them wanted to be around Nate. When Nate tried protesting that he should tag along and not split up, Ethan gave him a shove. "Start swimming," Daniel shouted at Nate. That seemed to make Nate's mind, and he started swimming towards the other side of the pool, shouting Samuel as he went. Daniel and Ethan started heading in the opposite direction, but some moron fired a cannonball right over Ethan's head. And the force of the water sent Daniel spiraling deeper and deeper in the water. Daniel quickly fought his way up to the surface again, but when he did, he couldn't see Ethan. Feeling angry and frustrated, Daniel started swimming, shouting Ethan's name as he went. Finally, Daniel found Ethan trying to hold his breath underwater. Daniel and Ethan searched in the pool for another 10 minutes. Ethan suggested that Samuel might not even be in the pool, but Daniel said, "We tried searching everywhere." "Well, maybe he is somewhere in the crowd," countered Ethan. As Ethan and Daniel climbed out of the pool, that lifeguard, Noah, showed up again out of nowhere. "Oh great, what does Noah want now?" asked Daniel. "Have you found my missing brother?" asked Daniel. Noah shook his head sadly. "Then what do you want?" snapped Daniel. Noah pointed to someone behind him. "I found this kid crying on a bench, saying you two abandoned him. So I am going to ask you, why aren't you two with a parent or guardian?" he asked. Daniel and Ethan looked over Noah's shoulder to see who he was pointing out. It was Nate. Daniel went scarlet in the face. "Why would you get out of your task to find Samuel?" asked Daniel. Nate's voice raised angrily as he lashed back at Daniel, "I didn't want to be separated." Ethan glared at his brother. Noah cleared his throat and said, "Why couldn't you three just stick together? You know that separation could be dangerous." Daniel glared at Noah. What use has this old man contributed to this task? And before he knew it his voice had risen to a shout. "For your information, the adult I am with is in the shallow end trying to find my missing brother. Which you guys should have been doing when you saw me asking people if they saw my brother. You should be fired." Noah's voice sounded surprisingly calm when he said, "Listen mister, the lifeguards." But Noah couldn't find the words to finish his sentence. Which Daniel took that to mean Noah hadn't been paying attention or cared about what has been happening in the past couple of minutes. Noah suddenly grabbed Daniel's arm. I am going to have to take you to the front office, and your adult is going to have to pick you up from there. Are you kidding me? Daniel yelled. He wrenched his arm from Noah's grasp, grabbed Ethan and Nate, and they all ran for it. They finally spotted Ava in the shallow end. At least they lost Noah in the crowd when they had passed the new waterslide. Daniel was shocked when he saw that it wasn't only Ava, Annie, and Laura, but Samuel was with them. As Daniel got closer, Ava pointed to him and she shouted, "Samuel is here." Samuel ran to Daniel and the two hugged. Annie joined them. "How did you guys find him? What happened after Nate shoved you?" Daniel stuttered. "Well," Samuel said to Daniel, "I remembered getting shoved underwater. Then when I got up to the surface, I realized I'd accidentally swam away from you guys and straight to the diving boards. When I got out of the pool, I started searching for you guys, but I got lost in the crowd. So then I went down to the shallow end, and I sat on the bench waiting for someone to find me. Everybody passing me didn't really pay attention to me and I was too scared to move, but then Ava found me." As Daniel hugged Samuel tighter, he vowed never to let anything or anyone hurt Samuel again. "Hey, don't forget about me," a laughing Annie says. Just then Laura pointed to something over in the distance. "Why is that lifeguard coming towards us? And why does he look angry?" Daniel looked to where Laura was pointing and saw an extremely angry Noah heading right for them. "Oh," he gasped. Noah's whistle was poised in his mouth as if he was ready to blow it at any moment. "Who is that guy?" Samuel asked. "No time for questions. Run to the car as quick as you can and let's get the heck out of here," replied Daniel. "Why are we running away from this guy?" Ava asked. "Maybe I broke a few rules trying to find Samuel and that lifeguard has so much hatred for me he's trying to chew me up and spit me out." Suddenly, Annie pointed to Noah, who seemed to be closer. "Better run while you can," said Daniel as all 7 of them ran for the exit. They finally spotted Ava's car. She quickly unlocked the doors and they quickly jumped inside. As Daniel's door closed, he stuck his head out of the window and made angry owl noises at the lifeguard. Daniel wasn't sure if Noah could hear him, but he could care less. They were off, driving away from the water park. The good news is Ava didn't put on any of that foul music she had on before. Ava didn't speak to Nate on the way to the house. In fact, everyone gave him the cold shoulder, except for Laura. She was attempting to console him. "We have to tell Mom about this," Annie said. "While you're driving you're not supposed to take your eyes off the road." Ava quickly looked at all the Nathaniels as she said, "Your mom is going to be very disappointed in me. And honestly, I like babysitting you guys. She is probably never going to drop you guys off at my house again." "I can't blame her." Just then Ethan shouted, "Mom, that semi is coming for us. If you don't get your eyes back on the road, we're all going to die." They narrowly missed the semi by inches as Ava swerved the car back into the lane. Ava swore at the semi-truck, but at last they were safe and Ava made sure not to take her eyes off the road. Annie looked back at her brothers and said again, "We have to tell Mom you went missing at the water park today." "Who agrees with me?" Daniel thought about it. He was sick of hearing Ava mistreat Laura and he didn't think he could stand another minute around Nate, but on the other hand, Ava did seem to care about them, in her own twisted way. Ava was right. If they told Mom about this, she probably would never let them stay with her again. Daniel and Samuel didn't reply to Annie, so you can say the ride back to the house was extremely silent. Finally, when they pulled up to the driveway at the house, Ethan said they had burnt him out with today's event. Sure enough, when they got in the house Ethan made his way to his bedroom and he fell asleep. He didn't even bother getting out of his wet clothes. Ava told Nate to take a shower and that he was grounded for a month. After Nate took his shower, Ava managed to find some clothes for Annie, Samuel, and Daniel. Daniel went in the shower first, then Annie, and finally Samuel. In Laura's bedroom, Laura was asleep on her bed while all the Nathaniels sat on the edge of her bed. For a little bit it was nothing but pin-drop silence. It seemed like Ava was exhausted from today's events that she passed out too, since there was no sound of the TV being played. Annie finally broke the silence. "Well, I am just thinking and we've got to tell Mom everything." Daniel couldn't believe the words that came out of his mouth next. "You know if we tell Mom, she will never let us come over here again." Annie fiddled with her hands as she said, "But guys, you have to agree that Ava is a bit reckless." Daniel and Samuel both looked at each other. She did have a point. "Boy, this is hard," Samuel says. "Why can't life give us a break?" Daniel added. For a while, the Nathaniels just sat there and went back and forth with whether or not they should tell Mom. Daniel and Samuel were both unsure of what to do. They turned back to Annie about 10 minutes later, but they saw Annie lying in a crumble heap on the floor asleep. Feeling exhausted, Samuel and Daniel dropped to the floor on either side of Annie, and before long they were conked out. Mom was standing in the doorway shouting at Ava. From what he could hear, Mom was yelling at Ava because Samuel was still missing. Then Ben suddenly appeared. Then an image of Samuel's terrifying face appeared. It was the same expression Samuel had when he had that encounter with the shark. Then, everything went dark. Suddenly Ava appeared yelling at Laura and Nate for being disappointments. Suddenly Daniel felt a sharp pain on his shoulders. Someone was shaking him awake. Daniel's eyes flew open, and he grabbed the person who was shaking him by the neck. For the second time, he realized he was grabbing Samuel by the neck and quickly let go. Despite his vows he would never let anything or anyone hurt Samuel again, there he was, hurting Samuel. He tried to console him and ask for forgiveness. It didn't take Samuel long to forgive him. "Why did you wake me up?" Daniel asked Samuel. "Well, you were shaking," Samuel says. "I woke up wanting to go to the bathroom, when I noticed you were trembling." "Did you have a nightmare?" Samuel asked. Daniel told Samuel everything he had just dreamt about and added, "I think I dreamed about everything that has gone wrong this summer. Like Ben appeared in my dreams, maybe because some part of me feels sad that we're not best friends anymore. And just think about how many times we had to hear Ava call Laura a disappointment over the summer. I feel like this whole summer has gone wrong." Samuel nodded in agreement. The Nathaniels had never experienced such a bad summer before. Daniel and Samuel didn't know what to do. Annie and Laura were still knocked out and they assumed Ava was asleep. Since they didn't want to make Ava all cranky, they didn't bother checking on her. Daniel and Samuel decided to check if Nate and Ethan were still asleep. When they both peeked inside their bedroom, they saw that Nate was conked out on his bed, but Ethan was awake watching some YouTube on his Nintendo. Daniel and Samuel were just about to close the door to leave Ethan in peace, when Ethan asked, "Do you guys want to watch some of this cool YouTube stuff with me?" Daniel and Samuel nodded and walked over. It was about 2 hours they spent watching some really cool YouTube shorts. There was this one that twisted Diary of a Wimpy Kid into Diary of a Violet Kid, and that one showed Greg violently cutting off Manny's head, and another one of a reaction to some kid watching a video of JJ short stories. Ethan muttered something about JJ short stories being cringe. "I think it's pretty cool," Daniel said as he watched a video of JJ cooking muffins all by himself. "I think I might hit the subscribe button so he can have another subscriber," Samuel added. 2 hours later, everyone woke up and Daniel and Samuel went back to Laura's bedroom. When they were inside, they saw Annie pacing near the door. So, what's on your mind?" Daniel asked, wondering why Annie was pacing intensively. Turns out that Annie had made up her mind, she was going to tell Mom. Right before Daniel and Samuel could speak, Ava shouted, "Dinner is ready. Come and get it." Then suddenly, Ethan and Nate's door flew open and the two boys rushed downstairs, soon followed by Daniel, Annie, Samuel, and Laura. When they arrived downstairs, Daniel's mouth fell open. "Spaghetti," he said gleefully. It was the first time he could remember feeling gleeful all day. The Nathaniels said prayers before they started devouring into their dinners. Ava was glaring at Nate and Daniel was still furious about him almost drowning his brother, but he started to think he might have overreacted just a tiny little bit. Though he wasn't going to say it out loud. Ava whisked away Nate's plate and told him he was lucky if Ethan gave him any of his food later and told him to go to his room because he was still grounded. After Nate stormed off to his room, everyone basically ate dinner in silence. The Nathaniels were looking at each other. Daniel and Samuel still hadn't made up their minds, but they figured Mom would hear it from Annie anyways. When everyone was done, Ava asked, "Does anyone want Nate's plate of spaghetti?" Samuel immediately raised his hand. After he had finished his second plate of spaghetti, they moved on to donuts for dessert. Mom, Laura said, do you have any more garlic sticks? Ava glared at her and said, first off, I didn't even have garlic sticks, and second of all, no one was talking to you. Annie jumped up and glared at Ava. Oh, for God's sake, can't you just give this a rest? For one day, Annie snapped at Ava. Surprisingly, Ethan's grin looked slightly different, as though it was forced. Ava looked shocked at Annie's outburst, but she didn't say a word. When Daniel, Samuel, and Annie were done washing the dishes with Laura, they went back upstairs to her bedroom. They were having some fun playing some card games when the doorbell rang. Oh, Daniel had felt as though a part of him had left him. Mom was here. The Nathaniels quickly shared a look and they all rushed downstairs, not bothering to finish their game. Just then Ava's voice rang through the whole house like a foghorn. Nate, get downstairs right now. I thought I was grounded, Nate said as he approached his mother. You are grounded, Ava said to Nate, but I am going to have you tell their mom what you did today. So she can blame you for what happened today since it was your fault. Daniel, Samuel, Annie, Laura, and Nate all looked taken aback by this news. Ava quickly unlocked the door and opened it. How are you kids today? Mom asked, walking through the door. When none of the kids answered, Mom turned to Ava, who began to shove Nate forward. Tell her what happened, Ava snapped at Nate. Before Mom could get a word out, Nate hung his head glumly and told her everything about how he might have accidentally drowned Samuel, the reactions of everyone, and how his mom had grounded him. He also mentioned everything with Noah the lifeguard. When he finished, Mom said to Nate, why in the name of Merlin would you do that? Ava nodded. I was wondering the same. Ava was interrupted as Mom glared at her. You are the flippin' adult here, this shouldn't have happened. You blame your son for trying to have fun and grounded him for an insane amount of time, but this is mostly your fault. Mom grabbed her kids and they stormed out of the house. On the ride back home, no one spoke at all. Daniel was wondering if they would ever go to Ava's again. An hour later, everyone in the Nathaniel household was asleep. The next morning, they did not go to Ava's. Mom sent Ava a message this morning, letting her know that she will not be dropping off the kids this morning. Ava didn't even respond to the message. After breakfast, Mom went to shower while the Nathaniels watched Cable 10 on the TV. 5 minutes into the show, Annie was getting sick of Cable 10 humor, and she went upstairs to read another book. When Mom was out of the shower, Mom called all the kids into the kitchen to discuss what they were going to do today. Daniel really wanted to go to the park, but Samuel said they should go skating, but Annie wanted to go bowling. Samuel groaned, he didn't want to see everyone get a strike but him. Why don't we take a vote? But just then her phone rang. Daniel, Samuel, and Annie thought it might be Ava calling. Mom picked up her phone from the countertop and answered it. It was not Ava, it was that Josh person again. When Mom hurried out of the room, the kids glanced at each other and without saying a word they all nodded in agreement. It was time to spy on Mom. They knew something was up with Mom and Josh, but wanted to know more. Daniel heard Mom's voice coming from her bedroom. They crouched at the keyhole listening in. For a while it was dead silence, but then they heard Mom say, well, Josh, the first night the kids were pretty angry with me and I didn't want another repeat of angry kids. There were a few moments of silence before Mom spoke again. That is true, but I'm not sure if the kids are ready to meet you just yet. A few more moments of silence, then Mom says, today was supposed to be their last day at her house, but Ava got a little too irresponsible. Then Mom began the story of the events that unfolded yesterday. Let's get out of here, Daniel said to Annie and Samuel. We haven't gotten any new info from this conversation. The kids quietly ran towards their bedroom, but something felt different. When Annie closed the door, Daniel blurted, it's obvious Mom is dating this Josh guy. I can't believe she has moved on from Dad. I mean, he has been gone since 2021, but still that's no excuse. You know? Samuel looked furious, but Daniel and Annie had looks of shock in their expressions. Suddenly Samuel started ranting, well, Mom is right. I definitely don't want to meet the guy and I hate him already. And also I wish Dad would haunt Mom for what she is doing. Who is with me on this? Samuel snapped. Samuel looked more furious when neither Daniel or Annie said they were on board. Samuel stormed out of the room cursing. Man, Daniel said to Annie, this summer is not like any we have ever had. When Mom got off the phone with Josh, 2 hours later, Samuel was nowhere to be found. Mom looked pretty worried about him and asked what had happened to make Samuel disappear like that. Daniel and Annie gulped. If they were going to tell Mom, they would be revealing that they listened in on her previous conversation. In a rush, Daniel tells Mom everything. Surprisingly, Mom didn't look outraged at all. Although, she was probably saving her telling off for when she had Samuel right in front of her. Samuel was found hiding in the snack pantry. "What the heck are you doing here?" Mom and Annie said at the same time. Samuel got up and glared up at Mom. "I can't believe you moved on from Dad. I hope he haunts you." Mom sighed. "I should have known you kids would have listened in on our conversation eventually." "That's no excuse," shouted Samuel. Mom sighed and glanced at the kids. For once she looked ashamed of herself. "I guess you're right, Samuel." Samuel glared at Mom. Daniel asked, "Why would you try hiding this from us?" Mom sighed again. "I thought you kids wouldn't want to get to meet or know him yet." "Well, you're right," snapped an angry Samuel. Annie lays her hand on his shoulders trying to calm him down. It didn't work. Samuel kept ranting on about how Mom is moving on from Dad. By the end of the rant, Daniel looked like he was ready for bed. As if the rant was a bedtime story. Mom glanced at Samuel. "Samuel, you must realize that life without your father is not the same, but I think it's time that I move on. I am sorry if this is painful for you and that I am making you feel like this. I should have handled this differently and I am sorry for that. I love your father and I always will, but I need to heal and find happiness in this life without him. Dating Josh is making me happy. Doesn't that count for anything?" "No," shouted Samuel, glaring at Mom again. "It doesn't amount to nothing in my head." Then Samuel stormed out of the pantry like a 2-year-old. After his angry departure, Daniel, Annie, and Mom each had different expressions on their faces. Daniel looked angry, Annie looked shocked, while Mom looked sad. Then Daniel sarcastically comments, "Wow. He totally handled that well." Mom glanced at them and asked, "Are you two at least ready to meet Josh?" Annie mumbled yes, sounding half-heartedly. However, Daniel had to give his honest opinion. "I may not agree with Samuel's actions and taking it out on you, but I don't think I am ready to meet the guy just yet." For an entire hour, the Nathaniel household was quiet as a mouse. Mom and the kids were knocked out. It was at this moment that Samuel had woken up. Samuel hated what he was about to do, but he was sick of this situation and everyone in it. He quietly started packing his bags upstairs, trying not to wake up anyone. He stuffed as many items in his bag as he could. Once he was done packing, he got out a piece of pen and paper. Samuel spent about a good 5 minutes writing and rewriting his letter before he finally felt comfortable with what he had written. He grabbed a bottle of Gatorade out of the refrigerator before heading out the door. Although he felt scared with what he was about to do, until he and his family were on better terms, about everything, he couldn't stand to be under the same roof as them. Samuel gulped. It suddenly dawned on him, the gravity of what he was about to do. He quietly opened the front door, and took one last longing look around. He made sure to lock the door one last time for who knows how long. Samuel whispered with tears in his eyes, "I will miss you guys." Then Samuel ran away. Thank you for listening to Disastrous Summer by J.J. Flores. Stay tuned for Book 2.